Ukraine's relations with its neighbors have always been intense and sometimes complicated. This is the reality of historical processes involving those who care about their past, let alone their future. Political and social circles, diplomatic games, business or even personal interests have been influencing relations between both countries and their citizens for centuries. This is the Ukraine Neighbors Points of Contact podcast, and here we are looking for commonalities in the relations between us and our neighboring countries. Ukraine-Hungary, a look back in history.
Common denominators in history and the same values. For many decades, relations between Ukraine and Hungary have been far from a roller coaster ride. The two countries demonstrated the same desire to get out of the prison of nations. In Hungary, this was especially evident during the 1956 revolution, when citizens took to the streets in anti-government protests and were massacred on the orders of then occupying Moscow authorities. Both Ukrainian and Hungarians started to move identically in the direction of the EU and NATO in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In 1991, they signed the treaty on the principles of good neighborliness and cooperation, which forms the basis of bilateral Ukrainian-Hungarian relations. The leaders of the two states often paid friendly visits to each other, met in person and talked on this phone call several times a year. Hungary was among the first countries to recognize Ukraine's independence and to condemn the Holodomor as a genocide against Ukrainians.
A turning point.
The decline in the dynamics of relations occurred in 2017. At that time, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine passed a law on education that changed approaches to teaching in minority languages and increased the number of teaching hours in Ukrainian. The Hungarian leadership viewed the innovation as an encroachment on the right of its citizens living in the Zakarpattia region. And the very topic of the Zakarpattia region, which had been a part of the Kingdom of Hungary for many centuries, began to appear more and more often in the domestic political rhetoric of the country's top leadership. Later, the messages of Hungarian politicians, most notably of the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, about supporting Ukraine in NATO and the EU changed. It is positioning of a government official on the global stage that plays a decisive role of him, and this is one of the factors that influence local relations with Ukraine, says Pavlo Klimkin, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2014-2019.
Пам'ятаєте, у нас років 20
If you remember, some 20 years ago we had a concept of multi-vector policy. Fortunately, it has long been forgotten. In some ways, Orban's policy is also multi-vector. Let's go to all of them and take something from each of them and maintain these relations. And this will be Orban's ambition and task number one. As for our relations, they will be determined not only by bilateral factors, but by Orban's desire to be a kind of mediator between Washington, Brussels, Putin, the Chinese, and so on and so forth. I think he will try to take over some aspect of the conversations. Perhaps it will be Budapest, but whether it will be difficult to predict now, since it is pure speculation. Although Orban would like this very much, because it is a chance for him to stay in power after 2026 and create his political, as it is nicely called in English, legacy.
таким добрим англійським словом legacy.
If we focus extensively on Hungarian-Ukrainian relations, the common point of contact, Zakarpattia, will not disappear, the diplomat adds, but suggests that it will not have a decisive influence.
Що стосується суто двосторонніх
As for purely bilateral relations between Hungary and Ukraine, in particular our Hungarians in Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia, Orban will at least try to solve some of his problems there, will try to present their solution inside the country as small victories. But in general, these will not be any radical steps that will somehow change the atmosphere of our relations. That is why I see Orban's ambitions and role as global, rather than purely bilateral.
в двосторонньому контексті.
What about now?
Viktor Orban's global ambitions are greatly driven by his ties with Russia. Hungary is interested in relations with this country primarily because of the economic context, in particular in the field of profitable energy cooperation. On the other hand, the Hungarian government is constantly receiving complaints from the European community about problems with corruption, the rule of law, and the treatment of national minorities, which has resulted in sanctions and freezing of funding from the EU Treasury. This situation creates narratives that the Hungarian leadership broadcasts to its society, and it does through the media, which is mostly fully controlled by the government agencies. Dorka Tokachi, research fellow at the Center of the European Atlantic Integration and Democracy in Hungary, says that the country has a large propaganda machine, and in the context of Ukrainian-Hungarian relations, it mostly broadcasts messages that are disloyal to Ukrainian issues.
It's very strong pro-Russian propaganda and very strong anti-Ukrainian propaganda. I hope that later on I also can elaborate on that. It's super effective because especially because there is no counterweight. We have independent journalists, we have excellent independent outlets as well, but they do not operate as a coordinated propaganda machine on the other side. So of course, they are independent editorials, they are excellent, but of course sometimes they even contradict to each other and so on, as independent editorials do. But like this, they cannot counterbalance as a propaganda empire. So what we say is that the Hungarian and Russian propaganda machines are clearly growing together. We do not have yet any document which would prove that there is an institutionalized relationship between the two. But what we clearly see that they refer to each other more and more. So the Hungarian apparatus refers to Russian sources, Russian state-funded sources all the time, and vice versa. Why does it work? Because the enemy pictures are the same. The enemy pictures are Ukraine, the enemy pictures are the EU, the US, and so on. So because of these overlaps, they do not even have to tailor their materials, and that is really scary.
In addition, says Hungarian analyst Dorka Tokachi, the government uses an interesting tool to manipulate public opinion. People are sent questionnaires with propaganda embedded in them, and the selective answers they receive are presented as the general opinion of the population.
So, for instance, there is one thing which is called so-called national consultation, which basically is a direct mail marketing campaign. So, when such a thing is announced, it means that every single household receives a letter in their mailbox with a highly propagandistic questionnaire. Usually it consists of about 8 or 9 questions grouped around a certain topic. The language of it tells everything to you. It's clear and sheer propaganda, yet it gives people the illusion, because it's free to send back to the government. Of course, the number of people, the number of these mails getting back by the government are never published. But after that, it gives an excellent ground of reference for the government, so that after that they can always refer to that this is the will of people.
The experts have analyzed what the Ukrainian media write about Hungary. They monitored the publications that appeared on the pages of central and local issues dated from September 2023 to September 2024. The monitoring included the all-Ukrainian Ukrainska Pravda newspaper and the state-run Ukrinform news agency and the regional Західний. All of them, without exception, most often mentioned of the country in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the statements of Hungarian leaders. Most of all, Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Minister of Foreign Affairs Péter Szijjártó. Separate coverage was given to Hungary's blocking of EU funding for Ukraine meetings between officials of both countries, while less attention was paid to Hungary's international relations. The topic of Hungarian interest in the Carpathia was not ignored. However, positive reports in the context of Ukrainian-Hungarian relations were rather the exception to the rule. In addition, for the local Західний, whose headquarters are located in Lviv, Hungarian topics, unlike, for example, Polish one, were not priority, while the national media covered it quite actively. The Hungarian Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy also conducted its own media monitoring. Its experts analyzed the most popular media in Hungary that broadcast government narratives. Then they conducted a series of focus group interviews with Hungarians to find out how they view Ukraine, its future and prospects for relations with the EU based on media reports. The survey revealed the effectiveness of Russian propaganda and the problem that most Hungarians know almost nothing about Ukraine.
And what we had found was actually terrifying. So really, Hungarian people overwhelmingly, being bombarded by this propaganda constantly, they overwhelmingly believed it. So they were mostly with really negative opinions about Ukraine. Not everybody, of course, because when the invasion just started, we have seen clearly that a large part of civil society went immediately to help. They really helped in many, many different ways. But what I want to say with all this, that during these focus group interviews, it was really, really difficult, but I tried to dig. I tried to dig deep. But what the hell causes these really intense emotions that these focus group discussion participants have shown? And it was super interesting, but because what came out of these focus group discussions was that the reason for these very difficult and very, very negative emotions towards Ukrainians had nothing to do with personal connections. Most Hungarians, so including the participants, have never ever met a single Ukrainian. So there were no personal grievances. Also, there were no grievances with regards to the Transcarpathian Hungarians. So it had nothing to do with the so-called Trianon trauma either. But what we had found, and this clearly underpins the power of propaganda, that most people found financial reasons. And you might ask why. So the Hungarian governmental propaganda on the summer of 2023, when Hungary's assets from the EU were already frozen since some time. So, of course, the anti-EU propaganda was constantly talking about this and parroting this, that, well, the EU withholds Hungary's money. And in the summer, in about July of 2023, when yet again the discussion on the EU level became more intense that the EU should yet again give 50 billion euro package to Ukraine, the Hungarian propaganda has connected the two messages. And what came out of it was that the EU wants to give the money of Hungarians to the Ukrainians. And they were pushing it with all these heavy weapons, all this heavy artillery of propaganda, that, well, Ukrainians do not deserve it, they are corrupt. And so they were painting it as if the undeserving, corrupt Ukrainians were getting the money that we deserve. And this was the message which went through the Hungarians. And this is terrifying to see. This is absolutely terrifying to see. But so to finish it with a silver line, that we clearly see that these very negative emotions are the results of a sharp top-down hate monger.
What common ground can Ukrainians and Hungarians find to counteract attempts to incite hatred between them? Can the change of power in the Hungarian state change the dialogue between the countries towards constructive pragmatism? We will talk about this in the next episode. As a teaser, here is a quote from the book Everything is Possible by American business strategist John von Aachen. Everything in the world is very changeable. Do not use outdated information, because any data obtained today may already be outdated tomorrow.
Seeking understanding and not hitting sore spots is an important skill for those who are responsible neighbors. This is the Ukraine Neighbors Points of Contact podcast, a project to find commonalities in Ukraine's relations with its neighboring countries. The podcast was created with the financial and organizational support of the Gайnrіха Bьолля Foundation, Kyiv office, Ukraine.